40 yards. That is the distance between a kitchen door and a barn door on a homestead claim along the lower Powder River in Wyoming Territory. A person can walk it in under a minute on a clear day. A child can run it in less. A stone thrown from the kitchen step will strike the barn wall without effort, and the sound it makes when it hits that flat wooden knock carries back to the thrower before she has lowered her arm. 40 yards. And in a storm, it is the distance between life and nothing at all. If this story stays with you, if it changes the way you think about the ground beneath your feet or the space between two buildings you pass every day without noticing, subscribe now. Because part 2 is where the earth begins to speak. The freight driver who brought the news also brought a bill. Torrim Kress had been crushed beneath a loaded wagon near Fort Fetterman 6 weeks before Solveig learned the word that would define the rest of her life. The word was not death. She had known death in Minnesota when she was 11, and her mother stopped breathing in a farmhouse bedroom, with frost on the inside of the windows. She had known it again at 14 when her father Halvor knelt in the root cellar to check the potato bins and did not stand up. Death was not new. Death was weather. It came and it took, and you counted what remained. The word was balance, not the kind a person keeps on a ledger, though that was part of it. The balance between what she had and what she owed. Between the animals that needed feeding and the feed that did not exist. Between the calendar and the ground, and the single body she had been given to work both with. A rear axle had split on a washboard grade, and the load shifted, and 2 men pulled Torrim free, but his chest was broken in 4 places, and he died that night on a plank floor in a way station, while Solveig slept 40 miles south in a cabin with 1 finished wall. The freighter's name was Doss. He rode a gray mule with a saddle sore on its left shoulder, and he delivered the news standing in Solveig's yard with his hat in his hands, the way men stand when they are holding something heavier than cloth and leather. She did not fall. She did not make a sound the freighter could describe later to the men at Pike's store. She stood with the water bucket still in her right hand, and the water moved inside the bucket in a slow oval because her hand was shaking, and the shaking traveled through the wire handle and into the water, and the water told the truth her face would not. Doss handed her the bill for the burial timber. $7. She folded it and placed it inside the tin cup on the shelf beside the stove where Torrim kept cash. And when she placed it there, her fingers touched the folded bills already inside, and she counted them by feel without removing them. $43. She had $43 and a dead husband and a bill for the box they put him in. She thanked Doss. He rode away on the mule with the sore. The canvas sheet over the unfinished west wall of the cabin moved in the wind, bellying inward and then pulling taut, and the sound it made was like breathing. Like the cabin itself was inhaling and exhaling around the empty space where a man had slept. The inventory did not take long. 2 sacks of flour, perhaps 80 pounds total. 1 barrel of oats for the horses, not for her. A cook stove with a cracked firebox plate, which meant she could not build a fire hot enough to bake bread properly. She had salt. She had a half tin of lard. She had dried beans enough for perhaps 6 weeks. And she had 11 cans of tomatoes that Torrim had bought in Sheridan as a surprise. And the surprise now was how small 11 cans looked when she lined them on the shelf and tried to see January in them. Outside, 8 draft horses stood in a corral of cottonwood poles lashed with rawhide. 3 milk cows and 4 calves pressed together in a lean-to that leaked from every seam. This was the Brea claim, 160 acres of Wyoming Territory grass bought with a dead man's name and held by a woman no one expected to last until November. She owed Rufus Crandall $76.50. Crandall ran the general store 11 miles north. A square building with a plank porch and a brass bell above the door that rang when customers entered and rang again when they left, so that Crandall always knew the rhythm of his commerce without looking up from his ledger. He had extended credit to Torrim for feed nails lamp oil, a length of stovepipe salt and flour, every item listed, every price exact. At the bottom, Crandall had drawn a line and written in his careful hand, payable in full or in kind before first snow. The note was legal. Under the Homestead Act, a widow could hold 160 acres in her own name. The law did not care that she had no sons, no brothers within 1,000 miles, no neighbor willing to bet his labor on her survival. The law said she could stay. The land said nothing at all. She could not leave. Her parents were dead in Minnesota. She had no money for rail passage and no destination that would accept a 26-year-old Norwegian widow with 8 horses she could not afford to feed and a debt she could not afford to pay. The claim was the only thing standing between Solveig Kress and the kind of poverty that has no floor, and the claim required her body on the ground for 5 years. The first visitor came on a Tuesday in late August. Captain Halldor Drennan rode a bay gelding with a cavalry brand still visible on the left hip. He was 58 years old, a former Union quartermaster who had turned his supply chain mind toward cattle after the war. He ran stock on open range north of the Powder River Fork and employed 6 men year-round. In the valley, his word carried the weight of a banker's signature. When Drennan said a thing would fail, men adjusted their plans accordingly. He dismounted without being invited. He walked the corral fence. He pressed a gloved hand against the lean-to boards. He looked inside the cabin where Solveig had hung the canvas sheet to block the wind through the unfinished west wall. He returned to where she stood, holding the water bucket she had not yet set down, because setting it down would mean her hands were free, and free hands had nothing to hold on to. 1 stack of hay. He pointed at the low mound near the barn. That is maybe a cord and a half. You need 6 minimum for 8 horses through a Wyoming winter. More if the winter is bad. You have a barn with cracks I can see daylight through from 20 feet. You have a cabin with 1 finished wall, and you have 1 pair of hands. Solveig set the bucket down. I have 2 pairs. She held them up, palms forward. The skin across her knuckles was already cracked from hauling water in the dry wind. Drennan did not smile. Those are not enough, not for what is coming. He told her the accepted strategy. Move the horses to a larger ranch that could absorb them for winter. Sell half the stock now before prices dropped in September. Or hire 2 men at 40 cents a day plus board to help cut hay and finish the cabin before the ground froze. Every option collapsed under its own weight. Crandall would offer pennies on the dollar for draft horses he expected to own by default. No rancher north of the Powder River wanted to feed another widow's animals when their own herds were already too large for the grass. And hired men at 40 cents a day would cost more than she had in 3 weeks, not counting the food she did not have to feed them. Sell the horses, keep the cows, work the claim with what remains. A woman alone can hold 160 acres with dairy stock and garden ground. You cannot hold it with 8 animals that eat like hired men and do no work in winter. He mounted and gathered his reins. Then he stopped. Your husband was not a fool, but he bought horses for freight work, and freight work requires a man. You have the horses. You do not have the man. He rode north without looking back. Solveig stood in the yard for a long time after he left. The canvas sheet inside the cabin snapped taut and went slack, snapped and went slack, keeping a rhythm that had nothing to do with rest. One of the horses stamped and blew. The light was already changing. The August gold was thinning toward the iron gray that meant autumn was not distant. It was here. She went inside and counted the flour. She examined the cracked firebox plate. She sat on the floor near the stove and pressed her palms against her knees until they stopped shaking. And she did the arithmetic out loud, because saying the numbers made them real in a way that thinking them did not. 8 horses, 3 cows, 4 calves, $43, $76.50 owed, 1.5 cords of hay, 1 pair of hands. The numbers did not change no matter how she counted them. October came fast and cold. The grass along the Powder River turned the color of old rope. The cottonwoods dropped their leaves in a single week of hard wind, and the bare branches clattered against each other like bones in a sack. Solveig had spent September cutting hay with a scythe she sharpened every evening until the stone wore a groove in the blade. She managed to add 2 more cords to the stack, bringing the total to 3.5. She needed 6 at minimum. The gap was visible from the cabin door, a stack that should have been twice as tall sitting in the brown grass like an accusation. The idea did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as failure. On the 4th of October, a squall blew in from the northwest without warning. Not a true blizzard that was still months away, but a driving mix of sleet and grit that turned the air white and dropped visibility to the length of an outstretched arm. Solveig needed to feed the horses. The barn was 40 yards from the cabin door. 40 yards. She lit a lantern, wrapped a scarf over her mouth, lifted a bucket of mash in her free hand, and stepped outside. The wind took the lantern flame before she had gone 10 steps. Not extinguished it, bent it sideways until the glass cracked and the wick guttered out. She kept walking, counting paces, but the sleet came from her left and then from her right, and then seemed to come from everywhere above, and the ground disappeared beneath a white that was not snow and not air, but something between, a substance that erased direction. She lost the wagon rut she had been following with her boots. She dropped the bucket. She could not find it again. She went to her knees and crawled one hand forward, feeling frozen ground until her fingers struck the barn wall. Inside, the horses were stamping and blowing. They had not been fed since morning. Solveig leaned against the wall and breathed through the scarf, and understood a thing she had known since childhood, but never felt in her body until that moment. Distance on the prairie in a storm is not measured in yards. It is measured in visibility. 40 yards of open ground might as well be 40 miles when the air fills with ice and the earth disappears beneath it. She fed the horses with what was already in the barn. A quarter measure, not enough. She waited 2 hours for the squall to thin before she crawled back to the cabin. The bucket she had dropped was 15 feet from the barn door. She had walked past it, 15 feet, and she had not known. That night she lay on the cabin floor near the west wall. The stove had burned down to coals because she had not added wood while she was in the barn. The floor was cold everywhere except one place, a narrow strip at the base of the wall where the boards met the packed earth. The cats slept there. They had always slept there. Animals do not read thermometers, they read surfaces. Solveig pressed her hand against the boards and felt warmth. Not heat, warmth. The difference between frozen and merely cold. The difference between a floor you can sleep on and a floor that kills you while you sleep. The memory came without effort. Her father Halvor kneeling in the root cellar of the Minnesota farm. She was 7 years old, standing behind him in the dark, watching him press his hand against the stone wall and then against the plank wall behind the cow stall. The cellar was dug into a hillside and the back wall touched earth that never froze. Feel, he said, and placed a small hand on the cold stone. Then he moved it to the plank. The plank was warm, not from any fire, from the cow behind it, from the ground itself. The earth does not make heat. It keeps what foolish people let escape. Solveig lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and thought about 40 yards, the cabin, the barn, 40 yards of killing ground between them. 40 yards that became infinite in a storm. But underground there was no wind. Underground the temperature held steady. Underground the earth was a wall thicker than any she could build. What if the barn and the cabin were not two buildings? What if they were one connected beneath the surface? She sat up in the dark and felt along the floor until she found a charcoal stick. She smoothed the flour sack across her knee and she began to draw. A trap door in the cabin floor near the stove. A sloped passage descending 5 feet below grade. A covered trench running 40 yards to the barn, shored where the soil was weak-roofed with poles and sod and earth. A second hatch inside the barn. A draft shutter to control airflow. The design was not genius. It was a root cellar stretched long and given doors at both ends. But the implications grew as she drew. The passage would be sheltered from wind. The earth walls would hold stable temperature. The horses breathing in the barn would generate warmth close to 100 degrees of living heat from each animal, and that warmth would move through the connected air slowly, gently into the passage and toward the cabin floor. She could feed twice a day in any weather. She could water without crossing open ground. She could check on a sick animal at midnight without risking death by disorientation. The design also carried a risk she could name but not yet solve. Collapse, seepage, bad air. Snowmelt flooding the passage in spring. Rats nesting in the walls. Rot in the roof timbers. A passage that became a grave if the soil was wrong or the shoring failed. She folded the flour sack and placed it on the shelf beside the tin cup and the burial bill, and the $43 that were now 36, because she had bought lamp oil and salt on her last trip to Crandall's store. She needed someone who understood Earth the way her father had. Dagny Ulfsson lived 4 miles south of Solveig's claim, in a sod house she had occupied for 9 years. She was 61 years old, a widowed Norwegian midwife who had helped build a turf-roofed cowhouse in Wisconsin before coming west. She knew drainage the way other women knew bread making, by feel, by smell, by the color of the soil on a shovel blade. She could read frost depth in October by pressing a knitting needle into the ground and timing how far it sank. She had buried a husband and 2 children on the prairie and stayed because the prairie was the only thing that had not yet left her. Solveig did not ride to Dagny's house with a plan. She rode with a question. How deep does the frost go here? And does the clay drain or hold? Dagny led her inside without greeting. She looked at the flour sack drawing. Solveig laid on the table and said nothing for a long time. Then she pushed a knitting needle into a pan of damp soil she kept near the stove for starting seeds. She poured water over the soil and watched it drain. Dig wrong and you build a grave with doors. Solveig waited. Dagny turned the pan and poured again. This time the water sat on the surface, pooling in the shallow depression the needle had left. That is what happens when you cut through clay and find no gravel beneath it. The water has nowhere to go. It freezes. It expands. It pushes your walls apart from below. She set the pan down. Tell me what you know about the soil on your claim. Solveig described it layer by layer. Topsoil thin and sandy near the surface. A band of brown clay starting at 2 feet. A mix of gravel and harder clay below 3.5 feet. She had seen this when Torrim dug the post holes for the corral. She had watched the shovel blade change color with each strike, and she had remembered because remembering the color of soil was the kind of thing her father would have done. Dagny listened with her arms crossed. When Solveig finished, Dagny asked a question that changed the design. Which way does water want to move on your land? Solveig did not know. She had not thought about it. Water fell, water soaked in, water froze. Water is not stupid. It follows the ground. If your ground tilts even 1 inch in 40 yards, the water will find it. Dig a passage and ignore the tilt, and you have built a cistern, not a corridor. Over the next hour, Dagny taught 3 principles that would hold the passage together or bury Solveig beneath it. First, crown the roof. A flat roof collects meltwater on top and lets it seep through the gaps between poles. A slight crown, even a few inches higher at the center than at the edges, sheds water sideways into the earth instead of straight down into the passage. Second, slope the floor. 1 inch of drop for every 8 feet of length. Not enough to feel while walking, but enough to keep water moving toward a gravel sump at the low end. Dagny said the sump should be near the barn, because the barn end would be lower on Solveig's land. Third, keep the passage small. Do not build a room. Build a throat. Air moves through a throat. Heat moves through a throat. A room just sits there and waits to fall. Solveig wrote Dagny's instructions on the flour sack below her own drawing. Crown the roof. Slope the floor. Shore the gravel section. Sump at the barn end. Keep the passage small. The words were plain. The principles were plain. The work would not be plain at all. Then Solveig asked the question that had kept her awake since she first pressed her hand against the warm strip of floor and felt the earth holding what the stove had given it. Can I finish it before the ground freezes? Dagny looked at the drawing again. 40 yards, 5 feet deep. That is. She paused, calculating 600 cubic feet of earth, minimum not counting the width. You are 1 woman with a shovel. 2 shovels. You are one woman with 2 shovels and perhaps 10 weeks before the clay becomes stone. If you dig and shore and roof at the same time, cutting corners, working past dark, neglecting the hay, you still need, she stopped herself. You will have to choose. Dig the passage or cut the hay. You do not have time for both. The gamble was plain. If Solveig spent autumn digging, she would not cut the 3 additional cords of hay she needed to carry 8 horses through winter. If she cut hay instead, she would have feed, but no way to deliver it when the weather made the barn unreachable. The passage was a bet against the calendar. Finish in time and the hay shortage becomes survivable because she can ration and deliver in any storm. Fail to finish and she has neither passage nor feed. Both paths held ruin. One held a chance. Solveig folded the flour sack and stood. Will you come look at the soil yourself? Dagny said nothing for several seconds. Then she reached behind the stove and pulled out a pair of heavy leather gloves with the fingers worn through at the tips. I will come look, but I am not promising to dig. She said this with a voice that meant she was already calculating the walk. Already thinking about the soil, already measuring in her mind the distance between a kitchen and a barn that she had never seen. 4 miles in the dark at 61 years old, because she had recognized something in Solveig's drawing that was not desperation. It was measurement. The young woman had drawn square corners. She had noted the depth at each end. She had marked the soil layers from memory. She had measured before she asked. And Dagny Ulfsson, who had buried a husband and 2 children and a cow house that stood for 12 years in Wisconsin, Clay knew the difference between a woman who was guessing and a woman who was counting. She picked up the soil probe, a thin iron rod with a T-shaped handle worn smooth from years of use, and tucked it under her arm. Bring the drawing, Dagny said, and bring a lantern. I want to see the ground before I see the dark. They rode south together through the last light of an October afternoon, and the wind followed them, and the grass along the Powder River bent flat against the earth as if it were trying to show them something about the direction things fall when they are no longer held upright. 40 yards, the distance between a kitchen and a barn, the distance a woman could walk in under a minute on a clear October day, carrying a bucket in each hand, counting her steps without thinking. And the distance that Solveig Kress was about to dig straight down into because the surface had already tried to kill her once and she did not intend to give it a second chance. Dagny arrived on foot the next morning before the light had fully committed to the sky. She carried the soil probe under her left arm and a cloth sack in her right hand. Inside the sack, a jar of rendered tallow for Solveig's hands, a ball of twine and a small stone weight she used for measuring slope. She did not bring food. She did not bring conversation. She walked the chalk line Solveig had drawn between the cabin and the barn, 40 yards staked every 6 feet. Twine pulled taut between them, and she did not speak for 20 minutes. She knelt at the edges. She pressed the probe into the undug ground ahead and pulled it back to examine the clay on the tip. She licked the tip once, tasting for mineral content the way a baker tastes flour, and spat sideways. Then she climbed down into the shallow cut Solveig had already opened, 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, barely 2 feet deep, and pressed her hand flat against the wall. The clay is good here, dense, holding itself. She looked north along the chalk line toward the barn. But ahead past the halfway mark, I feel gravel. Gravel drains. That is good for the floor, bad for the walls. You will need uprights there. Cottonwood. Cottonwood is soft. It will rot in 2 years. You do not have 2 years of time. You have 6 weeks. Cut cottonwood. Set it now. Replace it with cedar when you can find cedar. She stayed the rest of that day. She did not dig. She measured. She drove the soil probe at intervals along the chalk line and recorded the resistance in scratches on a flat piece of bark. Her own notation unreadable to anyone who had not watched her make it. By evening, she had mapped the soil for the full 40 yards. Dense clay for the first 20. Gravel-laced clay for the next 12. Hard-packed gravel over clay for the final 8 near the barn. The barn end will need the most shoring, and that is where you put the gravel sump. Water wants to go there anyway. Let it. She put on her gloves and picked up the probe. I will come back in 4 days. Do not dig past the 20-foot mark until I see the walls. She walked south into the dusk, 4 miles home in the dark at 61 years old. She did not explain why she was coming back. She did not use the word help. She used the word see, and the difference between those words was the distance between charity and respect. The first 6 feet of surface came away in slabs that Solveig stacked along the trench line for later use. Beneath the sod, the topsoil was sandy and loose, easy to shovel. She filled 2 barrows before noon. Below 18 inches, the clay began dense, heavy, wet enough to cling to the blade. Each shovelful weighed twice what the topsoil had weighed. Her shoulders burned before she reached 2 feet. By the end of the first full day, she had opened a cut 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and barely 2 feet deep. She needed a cut 40 yards long and 5 feet deep. She sat on the edge of the trench at dusk and did the arithmetic. At this pace, she would finish in 120 days. She had perhaps 50 before the ground became unworkable. The math said failure. The math had said failure since August. But now the failure had a shape, a shallow scratch in the earth that looked nothing like a passage and everything like a beginning that did not know yet what it was beginning. She went inside and ate cold beans from the pot and sharpened the shovel and went to bed without lighting the lamp. The clay taught her things that soil maps could not. Brown clay held its shape when cut. She could slice a clean wall and it would stand overnight without slumping. Yellow clay was weaker. It crumbled under its own weight if the wall was more than 3 feet tall, and it leaked a sour smell when wet like vinegar mixed with rust. Gray clay wept. It seeped water from veins she could not see until her boots were standing in it. And the water came not from above, but from sideways, traveling through the soil horizon, like a rumor traveling through a valley. She learned to read the shovel. A clean stroke that peeled a curl of clay meant the soil was stable. A stroke that stuck and required scraping meant moisture was close. A stroke that rang, that sent a vibration up the handle into her wrists, meant she had hit gravel, and gravel meant she was approaching the layer Dagny had warned about. Her hands bled through the gloves by the 3rd day. She wrapped them with strips of flour sacking and kept cutting. The wrappings turned brown with clay and red with blood and stiff with both. And she changed them every morning, and the old ones she burned in the stove, because looking at them made the pain real in a way that ignoring them did not. Day 7, 12 feet of trench open. Dagny returned as promised. She brought a 2nd shovel and a coil of rope, and she did not explain why. She walked the trench from end to end, knelt inside it at the 12-foot mark, and pressed both hands against the walls. You are cutting square corners. Is that wrong? No, that is why I came back. She stayed through the afternoon. She did not dig, her back would not allow it. And she said so without apology or embarrassment, the way a person states a fact about weather. But she did things Solveig could not do alone. She measured the slope of the floor with the twine and stone weight, adjusting the grade where Solveig's eye had drifted. She tested each section of wall by pushing against it with both hands, marking the ones that gave even slightly with a charcoal X. A charcoal X meant shoring. Shoring meant cottonwood uprights, which meant felling. Stripping, hauling, sinking. Each X was a day Solveig did not have borrowed from a calendar that was already overdrawn. Day 11. The first cottonwood upright set in the gravel section. Solveig and Dagny cut 6 trees from the creek bottom, stripped them with draw knives and sank them 3 feet into the trench floor. The uprights stood like ribs in a broken chest, waiting for the cross poles that would become the roof. Day 16. 31 feet of trench open, then rain. It came from the south, a cold soaking rain that lasted 9 hours. By morning, the east wall at the 24-foot mark had slumped inward, dumping 300 pounds of wet clay onto the trench floor. 2 days of digging erased in one night. The upright she had set in that section tilted 15 degrees from true. One had cracked. Solveig stood at the edge and stared at the collapse. The brown slurry filled the trench to ankle depth. The work she had done, the straight walls, the careful corners, the sloped floor Dagny had checked, lay buried under its own failure. She climbed down with a bucket and started bailing. 96 buckets, she counted. Not because counting mattered, but because counting was the only thing between her and the sound her mind was making, which was not a thought, but a pressure. The weight of a question she would not allow herself to ask aloud. She bailed until the floor was clear enough to check for damage, and the damage was worse than the slurry. A crack ran from the floor to within a foot of the surface along the east wall, where the clay met a sand vein she had not known was there. She packed it with gravel and tamped it with the flat of the shovel. The repair was temporary. She knew that. The crack knew that. The rain, wherever it had gone, knew that too. Day 22. Dagny arrived and found Solveig digging past the weak section instead of fixing it. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood at the trench edge and did not move until Solveig looked up. Stop digging. I am behind. You are behind because you are building forward on a broken foundation. Shore the weak section now or lose everything behind it the next time it rains. Solveig threw the shovel onto the excavated pile. The sound was flat and final. She stood in the trench with clay on her face and her hands wrapped in rags that were more blood than cloth. And she looked at Dagny standing above her in the grey light. And what passed between them was not anger. It was the recognition that one of them was right, and the other one knew it, but could not yet afford to feel it. She knew Dagny was right. She had been digging past the problem because facing it meant admitting she had lost 4 days she could not afford to lose. 4 days that were already gone. 4 days that the calendar had taken while she slept. They spent 3 days rebuilding the collapsed section. Dagny showed Solveig how to brace the weak wall with horizontal poles wedged between uprights, creating a lattice that distributed the soil pressure, instead of letting it push inward at a single point. Then she wove willow withes between the poles and the wall, a flexible mat that could absorb pressure without cracking the way rigid shoring did. The willow is not strong, but it is forgiving, and forgiveness is what this wall needs. The lattice held, the wall held, but 3 days were gone, and 3 days on a 50-day calendar are not 3 days. They are the difference between finishing and not finishing, between a passage and a scratch in the earth that fills with snow and becomes nothing. Gunnar Brekke saw the chalk marks first. He was riding past Solveig's claim on his way to the freight road, and he pulled his horse up short when he saw the white lines drawn in the dirt. The stakes driven every 6 feet, the twine pulled taut for 40 yards between the cabin and the barn. He dismounted and walked the line counting stakes. You are digging from the cabin to the barn. Yes. Gunnar looked at the chalk marks and then at the sky, and then at the ground as if consulting all three for an opinion none of them were willing to give. You are digging the road twice. Once down and once back up. In October. With no help. While your haystack sits at 3.5 cords. Solveig picked up the shovel leaning against the cabin wall. I can count the hay from here, Gunnar. I counted it yesterday, and I will count it tomorrow. The number does not change by looking at it. And it does not change by digging a ditch either. This is not a ditch. What is it then? She did not answer. She drove the shovel into the first chalk mark past the collapsed section and turned a square of sod. The grass roots tore with a sound like ripping cloth. Gunnar watched her cut 3 more squares before he mounted and rode on. He did not offer to help. He did not say she was wrong. He said something worse because it was true. The ground freezes in 6 weeks, 8 if you are lucky. Solveig kept cutting sod. The mockery reached Crandall's store by the end of the week. 2 cowboys from Drennan's outfit buying plug tobacco heard from Gunnar, who had not meant it as gossip, only as wonder, that the widow Kress was digging a trench from her cabin to her barn. They told Crandall. Crandall repeated the story to the next 3 customers who walked through his door. And by the following Saturday, half the valley knew about what Crandall called the prairie dog hallway. The phrase was precise in its cruelty. It made Solveig an animal. It made her work a burrow. It made the idea of connecting a house to a barn underground sound not just impractical but ridiculous. The kind of thing only a woman unfamiliar with real winter would attempt. Crandall held the confrontation in his store, where he had an audience. Solveig had come for nails, lamp wicks, and 2 extra shovels. Not oats, not flour, not the things a person preparing for winter in the usual way would buy. Crandall made a show of writing the order in his ledger, reading each item aloud. Nails 20 pounds, lamp wicks 6, shovels 2. He looked up. No feed, not today. Your horses eat today the same as every day. They eat what I have. He set his pencil down and leaned forward on the counter. 3 men stood near the stove listening. The room smelled of wood smoke and leather, and the particular stillness of men who are watching a thing they will talk about later. Mrs. Kress, I have a reasonable offer. $20 a head for 2 of the draft horses. Good animals. I have a buyer who will take them to Cheyenne in 2 weeks. That is $40 in your hand. Enough to clear half your account and buy proper feed for the rest. $20 is not what those horses are worth. $20 is what those horses are worth to a woman who cannot feed them. The 3 men by the stove shifted their weight. One of them, a young cowboy named Lem, grinned at his boots. Solveig counted coins from a leather pouch and placed them on the counter. 1 pound of coffee. And please write the nail quantity correctly in your ledger. It is 20, not 12. The store went quiet. The correction was small but public. A storekeeper who shorted his own records was a storekeeper who could not be trusted, and every man by the stove heard it. Crandall's expression tightened. He wrote the number. He wrapped the coffee. He did not repeat his offer. But as Solveig loaded the shovels into her wagon, Crandall followed her to the door and said one more thing, quiet enough that the men inside could hear it but pretend they had not. I hold your feed note, Mrs. Kress. $76.50. That note is payable at my discretion. If I decide you are a risk, I can call it in before Christmas. Solveig climbed onto the wagon seat. Then I had better not be a risk. She drove away. In the wagon bed behind her, 20 pounds of nails and 2 new shovels rattled against the boards, and the sound was sharp and bright and certain. And it carried across the yard and into the store, where Crandall stood in the doorway with a face that held the particular stillness of a man who has revealed his leverage too early and knows it. Day 29. The halfway point. 20 yards of trench open shored, where needed floor sloped walls standing. 20 yards remaining. The first hard freeze arrived that night. Solveig woke to find the water bucket in the cabin crusted with ice 1/4 inch thick. The earth was harder than yesterday. Every stroke of the shovel sent a shock through her wrists and into her shoulders. The clay no longer peeled away in satisfying curls. It fractured in brittle chunks that flew sideways and struck her shins. She was not digging anymore. She was breaking. Behind her, 20 yards of covered trench. Ahead, 20 yards of frozen ground. Above, a sky the color of slate pressing down like a hand on a lid. She swung the shovel. The blade rang against the clay like iron striking iron. Haldor Drennan came back on day 38. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared at the trench edge on horseback, looking down at Solveig, who was shoulder-deep in the earth face streaked with clay dust hair, tied back with a leather cord that had once been a bootlace. He dismounted and walked the length of the open trench, now 32 feet long, and fully shored for the first 20. He looked at the cottonwood uprights, the horizontal braces, the willow lattice on the repaired wall, the crude but level floor with its barely perceptible slope toward the barn. He knelt and examined the nearest upright. He wrapped his hand around the cottonwood and pushed. The post held. He pushed harder. It held. He stood and walked to the stack of roof poles waiting along the south side of the trench. These are too far apart. They are spaced at 24 inches. For dry soil, that might hold. This is not dry soil. By January, that earth will be saturated with snowmelt pressing down from above. Wet soil weighs 1/3 more than dry. And if a horse walks above the passage, and your horses will cross this line between the corral and the water trough, a 1,200-pound animal on 24-inch spacing over wet soil will break through. He pointed at the section nearest the barn. Here. Where the animals cross, 18-inch spacing, heavier poles, the thickest cottonwood you can find, or better yet, a few lengths of cedar if you can get it. Solveig climbed out of the trench. She looked at the stack of poles she had already cut. Half of them were sized for 24-inch spacing. Changing to 18 near the barn meant cutting more poles, more trips to the creek bottom, more days. You are telling me to tear out work I have already done. Drennan met her eyes. I am telling you that the work you have done is not strong enough. You can be angry about that or you can fix it. He mounted and gathered his reins. I do not think this passage of yours will work, but if you are going to build it anyway, build it so it does not kill you. He rode away into a wind that had turned north. Solveig stood at the trench edge and looked at the poles, and counted them, and counted the days, and counted the distance still to dig. She pulled 6 poles from the stack and carried them to the creek to exchange for heavier ones. 3 days of work repositioned, not wasted repositioned. And she thought about Drennan's hand on the upright, how he had pushed it and it held, and how he had pushed harder, and it still held, and how he had said 18 inches in the same voice a man uses when he is explaining something to someone he expects to still be alive in spring. He was not dismissing the passage, he was correcting it, and correction from a man like Drennan was closer to belief than anything he would say aloud. The sabotage came on day 40. Solveig returned from cutting poles at the creek bottom to find the trench gate a simple board she had fitted across the barn end opening to keep debris out lying flat on the ground. The leather hinges were intact. Someone had lifted it off and laid it aside. Sleet had been falling for an hour. Water was running into the low section of the trench in a steady stream pooling in the passage where the roof poles had not yet been laid. She found boot prints in the mud near the gate. Small boots, a boy's boots. Crandall had sent 2 of his stock boys to retrieve a stove collar fitting that he claimed Torrim had bought on credit and never paid for. The fitting was worth perhaps 30 cents. The boys had come while Solveig was at the creek, taken the fitting from a nail inside the barn, and left the trench gate open on their way out. Whether the gate was opened deliberately or through carelessness did not matter. The result was the same. 2 inches of brown water covering the floor for a stretch of 8 feet. The east wall softened where the clay met a sand vein. A crack ran from the floor to within a foot of the surface. Solveig bailed water by lantern until her arms would not lift the bucket. She stopped counting at 104, more than last time. The trench had a longer memory than she did. Dagny arrived at dawn and found Solveig asleep in the trench, sitting upright against the west wall with an empty bucket in her lap. Her hands were open on her knees, palms up the wrapping soaked through with clay water. Dagny touched her shoulder and said nothing until Solveig's eyes focused. Who opened the gate? Solveig told her. Dagny looked at the crack at the repaired wall at the bucket marks in the mud. Crandall's fitting is worth a quarter. Your wall is worth your life. He knows this. She said something else in Norwegian, a single word that Solveig's father would have recognized, but would not have repeated in front of his daughter. They spent the morning reinforcing the damaged section with the willow technique Dagny had taught before. A double layer this time, woven tighter. Solveig fitted a new gate with a drop bar latch that could not be lifted without tools. Day 44. Gunnar Brekke appeared with a wagon load of gravel. He did not knock on the cabin door. He simply drove his wagon to the barn end of the trench unhitched and began shoveling gravel into a pile near the sump. Solveig heard the sound from inside the passage, the rattle of stones hitting stones, a sound she knew as intimately as her own breathing by now, and climbed out through the cabin trapdoor to find Gunnar sweating through his shirt in the November cold. The creek bed was in my way. The creek bed was 2 miles from his claim and in no one's way. The gravel was sorted large stones on the bottom of the wagon, finer gravel on top, which meant he had spent at least half a day loading it by hand. Solveig did not thank him. She understood that thanks would require him to admit what he was doing, and admitting what he was doing would require him to admit that the passage might work, and admitting that the passage might work would require him to reconsider everything he believed about winter and labor, and what one woman could accomplish with 2 shovels and a flour sack drawing. She picked up a shovel and helped him unload, and neither of them said a word until the wagon was empty. Gunnar climbed back onto the seat and gathered his reins. Then he paused. The floor near the cabin end, it is warmer than the air outside. He drove away. He did not look back. But he had said the word warmer, and the word sat in the air between his wagon and Solveig's trench, like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples from it would reach further than either of them knew. The last 8 yards were the worst. The ground near the barn sat over a bed of compacted gravel that rang like crockery under the shovel blade. Each foot of depth required a pick as well as a shovel, and the pick handle cracked twice before Solveig wrapped it with wire and rawhide. Dagny was there for the final push. She had been coming every other day since the sabotage, staying longer, each time sleeping in the cabin on a pallet near the stove. She did not pretend this was casual. I am old. The walk is long. The days are short. If you have room, I will stay until it is done, or until I cannot stay any longer. They worked in silence for hours at a stretch, communicating by gesture. A pointed finger for a misaligned pole. An open hand for a tool request. A fist wrapped against timber to test its ring. They developed a rhythm. Solveig placed a pole across the uprights. Dagny spread brush over it. Solveig shoveled a layer of hay. Dagny packed sod on top, and both of them shoveled earth over the sod until the roof was buried under 3 feet of packed soil. Day 48. The passage was complete. 40 yards of covered trench, 5 feet from floor to roof, ground 3 feet wide at the bottom, 4 at the shoulder. The cabin trap door fitted square and tight. The barn hatch opened upward on iron hinges Solveig had bought with 4 of her $43. A draft shutter made of 2 overlapping boards controlled the airflow at the barn end, and a second emergency hatch. Dagny's insistence opened near the barn through a short vertical shaft covered with a weighted board. One door in a storm is a coffin. Solveig had not questioned it again. She descended through the kitchen trap door that evening with a lantern and walked the full length. The flame held steady at the cabin end, where the air was still and faintly warm. At the midpoint, it flickered once, responding to a seam in the roof, where 2 poles did not meet perfectly. At the barn end, it wavered in the draft that crept past the shutter, carrying the smell of horse and manure and the sweetness of oat mash. She tested the passage the way Dagny had taught her. Lantern first to check for dead air. Then a bucket of water poured on the floor at the highest point, watching it travel the slope to the sump. Then a night spent with the trap door open and the draft shutter cracked, measuring how the air moved. The results came through small changes she could see and feel. The cabin floor near the trap door no longer froze solid overnight. A crock of water left by the passage wall formed skin ice on its surface, but stayed liquid beneath, cold but not frozen. The difference between survival and mathematics. The horses were the engine she had not explained to the skeptics. Each animal standing quietly in the barn radiated heat close to 100 degrees of warmth 12 hours a day, passively, without fuel, without labor. 8 horses meant 8 furnaces breathing into a connected space. The barn air warmed by their bodies drifted through the draft shutter into the passage. The passage, insulated by 3 feet of earth, carried that air slowly toward the cabin. The cabin floor, pressed against the earth above the passage, stayed warmer than the walls, warmer than the windows, warmer than any surface not directly beside the stove. The system was not a heater, it was a blanket. The earth held what the horses gave, and the passage moved it where Solveig needed it, and the cabin received it without asking and without waste. A newspaper scrap reached the valley in early December. Storms had struck western Kansas and Nebraska. Cattle were drifting where snow had crusted over grass. The telegraph wires between Dodge City and Denver had been unreliable for a week. Nobody knew exactly what was coming. But the freighter who brought the news said the men at the last station had been stacking wood like they expected not to see spring. Dagny heard the news and went quiet. That evening she sat by Solveig's stove and touched the frost crystals that had formed on the inside of the barn hatch, where warm, moist air from the passage met the cold metal of the hinges. Warmth is moving. So is water. Remember both. The frost was evidence of two things at once. The passage was working, carrying warm air from the barn toward the cabin, and the moisture in that warm air would condense and freeze wherever it met cold surfaces. The hatch hinges, the draft shutter frame, the underside of the roof bolts near the barn end. Every place where warm met cold would grow ice, and ice was weight, and weight was pressure, and pressure was the thing that broke tunnels. Solveig lay in the dark that night and listened to the wind testing the cabin walls. The trapdoor near the stove was closed. Beneath it, 40 yards of earth and timber waited for the thing everyone had been talking about since August. The storm arrived on a night in January when the sky had been clear since dusk. Solveig had fed the horses at sundown and closed the barn hatch and climbed back through the passage and latched the trapdoor and set water on the stove for tea. Dagny was asleep on the pallet near the wall. She had been coughing for 3 days, not the shallow cough of cold air, but the deep, wet cough that came from behind the ribs and left her grey-faced and gripping the edge of the pallet with both hands. At 9 o'clock, the wind changed direction. It did not shift gradually. It swung from southwest to northwest in the time it took Solveig to cross the cabin floor. And when it hit the north wall, the stove smoke reversed and came down the pipe in a grey plume that filled the room with the smell of creosote and ash. Outside, the barn bell she had tied to the latch rang once. Then again. Then it began ringing without pattern. A disjointed clanging that meant the wind was hitting it from multiple directions at once. Solveig opened the cabin door 1 inch and looked out. Snow was not falling. Snow was moving horizontally, then diagonally upward from the ground, then in spirals that caught the lantern light and made the air look solid. The barn was 40 yards away. She could not see it. She could not see the corral fence 12 yards away. She could see the first fence post, barely a dark smear in the white, and beyond it nothing, nothing at all. She shut the door and latched it. Dagny was awake, sitting upright on the pallet, her face the color of candle wax. The cough had taken something from her overnight. Not strength exactly, but the reserve behind the strength of the place a body draws from when the first supply runs out. How bad? I cannot see the barn. Then you do not open that door again. The stove was useless with the chimney reversed. The cabin temperature began to drop immediately. Solveig could feel it on her face first, the skin tightening, the moisture in her nostrils turning sharp. She pulled every blanket off the bed and wrapped Dagny in 2 of them. Dagny protested. Solveig did not listen. She opened the trapdoor. Warm air rose from the passage, not hot, not comfortable, but warmer than the cabin by 15 or 20 degrees. And the warmth carried with it the smell she had come to know better than any perfume or any bread. The mineral sweetness of earth that is holding what the surface has lost. 8 horses standing quietly in the barn, breathing into a connected space, radiating heat they did not know they were giving. She descended with a lantern, a bucket of mash, and a wool scarf pulled over her mouth. The passage walls pressed close. The floor was damp but not flooded. Dagny's slope was working the water, moving toward the sump. Halfway through, she heard a sound from above. A low groan, deep and sustained, like a large animal shifting in sleep. The roof poles were taking the weight of snow accumulating on the surface, and the timber answered the load with a voice that made her stomach drop. She kept walking. The barn was chaos, held in check by walls. 2 of the horses were sweating their necks, dark and slick, their eyes showing white. They had heard the wind and felt the pressure change, and every instinct in them said, "Run." The other 6 stood pressed together, in the center heads low, breathing in unison. She fed them. She moved between the animals with the bucket, speaking low, touching necks and flanks, steadying the frightened ones by standing close enough that they could feel her weight. She checked the water trough. Not frozen, not yet the horse heat keeping the barn above the line, and broke the skin ice on the surface. Then she saw the top vent. The hinged board was banging in the wind, open and closed, and each time it opened, a blast of snow and air hit the barn ceiling and dropped the temperature for 3 seconds before the board slammed shut again. Dagny's warning from weeks ago spoken while rubbing frost crystals between her fingers. Warmth is moving, and so is water. If the vent stayed open, the moisture from 8 breathing horses would freeze on every surface. If it stayed closed, the air would thicken until the animal's lungs struggled. Solveig climbed onto a hay bale, then onto the side rail of a stall, and wedged a folded piece of burlap into the opening. A gap the width of 2 fingers remained, enough to breathe through, not enough to lose through. One of the cows was standing oddly, hind legs wide, tail raised. The fluid on the straw told her what the posture had already said. The cow was calving, here, now, in the middle of a storm that was killing everything it could reach above ground. She cleared a space. She brought warm water from the trough in a bucket. She knelt behind the animal. The calf came wrong, 1 leg forward, 1 leg back, and she had to reach inside and reposition the second leg while the cow bellowed and strained and the barn groaned around them. Her hands were slick, her knees were soaked. The wind outside was making a sound she had never heard wind make, not a howl, but a pressure, a weight against the walls that she could feel in her teeth. The calf slid free. She cleared its mouth and nose and rubbed its ribs with a handful of rough sacking until it coughed and breathed. Small and wet and shaking, but breathing. The cow turned and began to lick, and the calf's legs moved in the straw, searching for a ground that would hold still. She was climbing down through the emergency hatch on her second trip when she heard pounding, not wind, not timber, but fists. Gunnar's voice muffled by snow and walls shouting a name she did not recognize. She came up through the barn hatch and found Gunnar kneeling in the snow beside the barn wall, and beneath him a shape that was not adrift. Leif Thorsen, 23 years old. One of Drennan's riders sent to check the north fence line before the storm reached full force. His horse was gone. His left hand was white to the wrist. He was not conscious. They could not carry him through the main barn door, drifts chest high against it. Solveig opened the barn hatch wide, and Gunnar lowered Leif's body into the passage feet first. Solveig guided him from below, pulling his shoulders through the opening, while Gunnar pushed. Leif made a sound that was not a word, and not a scream, but something between the sound a body makes when it passes from cold, that kills, into air that merely hurts. They carried him through the passage 40 yards. Gunnar at the feet, Solveig at the shoulders, hunched beneath the low roof, the lantern swinging shadows across the earth walls. Dagny met them at the cabin trap door, coughing, and together the 3 of them lifted Leif into the cabin and laid him on the pallet. Dagny examined the frozen hand with the calm of a woman who had seen frostbite before and knew which colors meant salvage and which meant loss. She packed it in cloths soaked with cool water, not warm cool, because warming too fast destroys what cold has merely stunned. Leif Thorsen kept 3 fingers because of the temperature inside that passage. 40 yards of earth that held enough warmth to make the difference between a hand that heals and a hand that comes off at the wrist. Solveig made 2 more trips through the passage that night. Each time the earth above her groaned. Each time the barn hatch was harder to push open because blown snow was packing around the frame. On the second trip, the main hatch would not move. She threw her shoulder against it twice before it cracked free, and when it opened, snow cascaded into the passage entrance, and she had to shovel it clear before she could enter the barn. On the third trip, she used the emergency hatch, the vertical shaft near the barn, covered with a weighted board. It opened cleanly. Its shaft was sheltered from horizontal drifting. The snow could not reach it the way it reached the angled hatch. 1 door in a storm is a coffin. Dagny had been right. Dagny had been right about everything she could not dig and most of what she could. The wind held its fury through the night. Solveig stopped counting the hours. She moved between the cabin and the barn through the passage the way a heart moves blood through a body, back and forth, carrying what was needed, where it was needed, and the passage held. The crowned roof shed the meltwater sideways. The sloped floor drained the condensation to the sump. The uprights bore the weight. The willow braces on the repaired wall flexed and held. The 18-inch spacing near the barn. Drennan's correction, the one she had resented, the one that cost her 3 days, carried the weight of wet soil and snow without cracking. Outside, the valley was dying. Gunnar Brekke tried to cross the 60 feet between his cabin and his cattle shed at midnight. He made it 30 before the wind put him on his knees. He crawled the rest. He lost 2 calves before morning, one frozen against the shed wall, one smothered in a drift. Drennan's riders could not reach the lower pasture where 200 head stood in the open. They tried at dawn and turned back after a quarter mile. In Crandall's rented lot behind the store, 30 head of cattle crowded the leaf fence. The fence was not built for the weight. A section gave way, the section Crandall had patched with wire in October, rather than spending $3 on new rails, and the cattle walked through the gap into the storm. He found 7 of them alive 3 days later. After 36 hours, the wind stopped. Not gradually. It simply stopped the way a voice stops mid-sentence, leaving a silence so sudden and complete that Solveig stood in the cabin and waited for it to resume. She dug through the drift that had buried the cabin door. When she stepped outside, the valley was white and silent. No cattle bawling, no wagon noise. The only sound was the creak of frozen cottonwood branches along the river and the faint hiss of dry snow settling under its own weight. And in the white shapes that should not have been there, low dark humps scattered across the snow, some alone, some clustered against fence lines and creek banks. She knew what they were. She had seen dead cattle before. She had never seen them by the dozen. She turned back toward the cabin. Inside, Dagny was coughing. Leif Thorsen was unconscious but breathing. The calf stood on unsteady legs. The horses stamped in the barn, waiting for morning feed. Everything she was responsible for was alive. Drennan came on the 3rd day after the storm. He opened the barn door. The main door which Solveig and Gunnar had dug clear the previous afternoon. And 8 draft horses turned their heads and looked at him with the calm, liquid patience of animals that had been fed that morning. The water trough held water, not ice. The calf stood in the straw beside its mother. The barn smelled of hay and manure, and the thick, grassy warmth of living bodies. He walked between the stalls without speaking. He knelt and opened the hatch and looked down into the passage where the lantern Solveig had hung on a nail threw yellow light across the earth walls. He stayed on one knee for a long time. When he stood, Solveig was leaning against the stall rail behind him. I was wrong about the passage. I was not wrong about the weight. You made it strong enough anyway. You told me to fix the pole spacing. I fixed it. He looked at the hatch again. How warm is it down there? Come see. They descended together. Drennan had to duck the 5-foot ceiling pressed against his hat. He walked the full 40 yards in silence, one hand running along the wall. At the cabin end, where the air pooled near the trap door and the earth held the slow heat of 8 horses, he stopped and spread his palm flat against the wall. That is not frozen, no. He took a breath and let it out slowly. His breath did not cloud. Inside the passage in January, his breath did not cloud. I will send 2 of my men to see this. Send them. I will show them everything. Gunnar came last. He waited until the riders and the neighbors had visited and left. He came alone on a morning when the temperature had dropped below 0. He stood in the barn and looked at the hatch for a full minute. My calves died 60 feet from my front door. Solveig said nothing. 60 feet. I could throw a rock that far. I tried to reach them, and the wind put me on my knees in 30. He descended into the passage. He walked slowly, one hand on the wall. At the midpoint, he stopped. The floor is warm, warmer than outside. Not warm, warmer than my shed, warmer than my cabin floor. He pressed his hand against the wall and held it there. The same gesture Drennan had made. The same gesture Solveig's father had made in the root cellar in Minnesota. People needed to feel the earth not freezing before they could believe it. Can this be built shorter? I do not need 40 yards. I need 60 feet. 60 feet is easier. The roof span is the same. The digging is less. I will need help. It was the hardest sentence Gunnar Brekke had spoken since the storm. I know, Dagny and I will mark the line for you. But Dagny did not mark the line. Dagny's cough did not improve. It settled deeper, moving to a place behind her ribs that made her wince when she breathed. She stopped walking to her own cabin. She stayed full-time on the pallet in Solveig's kitchen, and the space between the stove and the wall became her country. A small territory of blankets, tea, a Norwegian Bible with a cracked spine, and the iron soil probe she kept beside the pallet like a walking stick she would not need again. She worked from the pallet. She drew passage designs for shorter buildings, calculated roof spans and drainage slopes on scraps of paper, argued with Solveig about details that would not matter for months. She revised the design for neighbors with different terrain. A cowshed passage could be shallower, 4 feet instead of 5. A storm hatch did not need a full vertical shaft. A sloped ramp with a hinged cover would drain better and resist drifting. They argued about rope lines. A passage connects 2 buildings. A rope connects 2 people. You cannot dig a tunnel to every place a person might need to go in a storm. You can tie a rope. A rope is not a tunnel. A rope is not a tunnel. But a person holding a rope is alive, and a person holding nothing is lost. She coughed hard. When she lowered the cloth, the spots were darker than before. I did not survive to 61 by refusing to carry a rope. Solveig strung rope lines the next day, from the cabin to the well curb, from the barn to the corral gate, from the corral gate to the haystack. Each line knotted at 6-foot intervals, tight enough to grip in a gloved hand tied to iron stakes, driven deep enough that the wind could not pull them. The ropes cost nothing but time. Dagny watched from the window and nodded once. Crandall's note arrived on a Tuesday in late March. $76.50 payable in full within 10 days. No extension, no partial payment. The timing was precise. Spring hauling season had not yet begun. The roads were still closed, the contracts unsigned. Crandall had chosen the 10 days because they fell in the gap between winter need and spring opportunity. He had calculated the calendar the way Solveig calculated soil layer by layer, looking for the weakness. Solveig sat at the kitchen table with the note and $32 in the tin cup. She could not pay in full. She could not sell a horse in 10 days at fair price. Crandall had told every buyer in the valley that her stock was encumbered by debt. But she could make his position more expensive than her failure. She rode to Drennan's ranch the next morning. She offered her 8-horse team for spring hauling at the standard rate $3 a day per team, with a 2-week advance of $50 against the work. The advance was unusual but not unreasonable. Drennan needed teams. Solveig had the best draft horses in the valley. 8 animals that had come through the worst winter in memory, without losing a pound because they had been fed every day, twice a day, through a passage that Drennan himself had walked and found sound. Drennan sent word back through his foreman. $50 advance, payable immediately, against 15 days of hauling starting April 1st. Solveig paid Crandall on the 8th day. She rode to the store, laid $76.50 on the counter, in coins and folded bills, and asked him to write paid in full on the note and return it to her. Crandall wrote the words. He did not speak. She bought nothing else. She left the store and drove home past the valley where the snow was melting, and the dark shapes of dead cattle were emerging from the white like a slow, terrible inventory of everything the open range had cost. She had been alone when she started digging. She was not alone now. A woman who saves her neighbor's stock and teaches her neighbor's methods is no longer isolated. She is owed. And the debt the valley owed Solveig Kress was not the kind that could be written in a ledger or called in before Christmas. Dagny died on a morning in early March when the first meltwater was running in the creek and green shoots were pushing through the sod on the passage roof. She woke at dawn and asked for water and drank half of it and set the cup on the floor beside the pallet. She said something in Norwegian, a sentence Solveig recognized from her father's speech but could not fully translate. Something about soil and patience and the weight of things that choose to stay. Then she closed her eyes. Her breathing changed from the ragged, wet sound it had been for weeks to something shallow and quiet. And in 10 minutes, it stopped. Solveig sat beside the pallet for an hour. She did not weep. She sat with her hands on her knees and looked at the soil probe leaning against the wall, and the cracked Bible, and the folded storm plan beneath it, and the spot on the blanket where Dagny's hand had rested curled and still. She buried Dagny on the south slope of the claim, where the soil thawed first in spring, and the cottonwoods would give shade in summer. She dug the grave herself. Gunnar came and offered to help. Solveig said no. Gunnar stood at a distance and waited until she was done, because he understood that some work is not about the body. It is about the right to say, I did this with my own hands for someone who did the same for me. Gunnar began appearing on Solveig's claim in the evenings. He brought small things, a repaired hinge, a bundle of willow. With a sack of oats he claimed had been mislabeled at the freight office. Each gift disguised as accident or surplus. He settled the gravel debt in August. He rode to Solveig's cabin on a Sunday afternoon dismounted and stood in the yard holding his hat. I would like to pay back the gravel. The gravel was free. I know. I would like to pay it back anyway. With what? Coffee on Sundays, if you are willing. Solveig looked at Gunnar standing in her yard with his hat in his hands and his horse shifting behind him. She saw a man who had crawled through a storm to reach his own animals and lost them anyway, who had carried a stranger through a passage he did not believe in, who had forged an iron probe to replace the one Dagny left behind. Coffee on Sundays. But no advice unless I ask. I would not know what to advise. He brought coffee the following Sunday and the Sunday after that, and every Sunday through the autumn and into the winter. Somewhere in that procession of Sundays, the coffee became supper, and the supper became conversation that lasted past dark, and the conversation became the kind of silence that two people share when they have stopped needing to fill it. They married in the spring of 1890. Gunnar did not ask Solveig to leave her claim. He moved onto her property and connected his small cabin with a short passage they dug together in 3 weeks. 30 feet long, 4 feet deep, shored and crowned and sloped. Gunnar never called it her claim. He called it the place. Solveig called it home, a word she had not used since Minnesota. A daughter, Astrid, born in 1891. A son, Halvor, named for Solveig's father in 1894. Both of them were told not to play in the passage, and both of them played in it, constantly chasing each other through the dark, counting uprights by field racing to see who could reach the barn hatch first. Solveig heard their laughter through the cabin floor, muffled by 3 feet of earth, and did not stop them. The passage was their inheritance. It would teach them what it had taught her. In 1903, Gunnar expanded the barn and dug a new passage section to connect the addition. He set the first upright, and Solveig descended to inspect it and found the pole plumb and the base packed with gravel and the spacing set at 18 inches without being told. Drennan would approve. Drennan approved 4 years ago. He told me at the table when you were in the barn. What else did he tell you at the table that I married above my competence? He was right. Gunnar laughed. It was a rare sound from him, and it echoed in the unfinished passage like something that had been waiting underground for a long time and was glad to finally move. Solveig Kress died in late autumn of 1917. Pneumonia that settled in her lungs during a cold October rain and did not leave. She was 57 years old. She died in the cabin in the bed she and Gunnar had shared for 27 years, with the trapdoor still fitted square in the kitchen floor, and the stove burning low, and the sound of horses in the barn coming faintly through the boards. Gunnar outlived her by 6 years. He kept the passages clear, and the hatches latched and the rope lines taut. When he walked the tunnel in the mornings, he carried the iron probe she had hung on the nail by the stove, not to test the soil, which he knew by heart, but because the weight of it in his hand was the closest he could come to holding what she had left behind. Years after that, snow covering the yard so completely that the cabin and the barn seemed separated by a white, impossible distance. No tracks between them, no path visible, just two buildings and the silence of deep winter pressing down on everything between. But beneath the kitchen floor, the old boards of the trapdoor still fit tight, and below them in the dark in the earth that smelled of clay and horse breath, and the faint mineral sweetness of ground that had been walked through 10,000 times, the passage waited. Damp, cold, solid, 40 yards long, the way to the barn. Have you ever measured the distance between where you are and where you need to be and realized it was closer than you thought and more dangerous than you knew?